Aztech Forgotten Gods is the sophomore title from Mexican developer Lienzo, who previously released Mulaka in 2018. Mulaka was lauded for its minimalistic and reverent depiction of the indigenous culture of northern Mexico's Tarahumara. For their second game, Lienzo got a bit more ambitious in terms of scale, while once again depicting a specific area of Mexican culture with a rich history. Aztech released on March 10th, 2022 for PS5, PS4, Xbox Series X and S, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and PC. Aztech Forgotten Gods is a semi-open world action-adventure game, though it's self-described as a Latinx futurism cyberstone colossus fighter by developer Lienzo. In Aztech Forgotten Gods, players assume the role of Actli, a cybernetically enhanced warrior on a quest to save Tenochtitlan, her home and the center of the Aztec Empire. Armed with Lightkeeper, Actli will attempt to destroy the gods that are seeking to wipe out her beloved city. The player will engage in action-packed combat that blends mobility and precision timing during intense battle sequences with large-scale enemies. Alright, now that we've got the basics down, let's get into the details. The concept for the game's setting, a futuristic, alternate history version of Tenochtitlan, is unique and interesting. It's not executed amazingly well, but a great idea is certainly there. The freedom of movement in the game feels pretty great. Flying around the city like Iron Man or Super Saiyan is fun and doesn't really get old. You'll get used to the mechanics pretty quickly and feel like a master of motion in no time at all. The game's kinetic combat is somewhat satisfying and a fascinating seed for something more, even if the plant isn't fully grown, much less the flower blooming on said plant. There are a few segments of black and white hand-drawn storyboard-like cinematics that look like they came out of a concept artist's sketchbook. These are really neat, and I wish we got more of these to move the story forward than uninteresting cutscenes that seem to go on for too long. The game presents a few character customization options that you can unlock, and I'm putting this here in the standouts section because it was totally unexpected and didn't need to be included. You can unlock options by completing fight and race challenges around town and earning in-game currency. These unlocks allow you to change your Actli's clothing and hairstyle, and there are fewer than 10 unlockable options for each, but at least it's something. Visually, this game is ugly, and that's really unfortunate because you can tell that there's a certain art style that they were going for, but it certainly does not land. And the visuals can be quite inconsistent at times. Random NPCs around the city look like they just stepped out of a GameCube game at best. If there's nothing great to look at while you progress through the game, you'd at least hope there's something to listen to. Well, unfortunately, there's no voice acting in the game, despite there being a large amount of dialogue. All you get is a few grunts or sighs for every other line of text. It's disappointing, because the dialogue itself is actually fairly endearing and quite reminiscent of anime. But at the same time, there's also just way too much dialogue. Cutscenes can be long, and if you read every line, I would imagine that makes up about 2/3 of the entire game. Speaking of cutscenes, they're bad. The game tries so hard to have a major focus on story, but it has no idea how to do it. The poor cinematography in the cutscenes is unacceptable for a game that wants to present any kind of story in 2022. What is this camera angle? It's just the top of Actli's head. The story just isn't that compelling, though it so desperately wants to be. I blame the story presentation more than the idea itself, and like the dialogue, there's just way too much of it. There's too much story. At times, the story can be so nonsensical that I have to wonder if that's at least somewhat intentional. Actli's mother is a crazy scientist who puts her daughter into a dangerous situation early on in the game to kick off the series of events, which leads to a giant future tech artifact arm getting stuck to her, replacing her previous prosthetic right arm, and then just sends her daughter off to bed with said giant arm after a quote, long day. What? A long day? This isn't just a normal long day. You don't just accept this new giant mechanical arm and go to bed with it like nothing happened. And then, in the morning, Actli says she forgot she even had it on. I'm sorry, that's ridiculous. As you begin to roam around completing missions, you're directed to upgrade Lightbringer before you even have enough coins to do so. But then you can just progress the story, acting like you bought an upgrade without ever actually doing it. The same exact thing happens later on. At that point, you'll likely have enough coins for multiple upgrades, but you don't actually have to take any to continue. You go there to activate a shield ability, but you don't actually have to select any upgrade for that to happen, and you're never given a prompt saying you did anything. And then there's combat with Lightbringer. For most of the game, combat is just spamming one button. On PlayStation, it's square, without worrying about aim or anything, as the attacks will just lock on. It sort of reminded me of the combat in Final Fantasy XV, only an even more dumbed down version of that. Throughout the game, you fight a series of colossal bosses. Some of the boss fights have interesting ideas, but the mechanics are all pretty much repackaged and repeated with every boss. Fighting massive enemies while flying around like you're an anime protagonist is cool, but it quickly wears off when you're doing the same thing over and over and just getting frustrated with no direction. It's not always clear what you're supposed to be doing, whether it's removing a shield or something like that. The fights aren't particularly difficult, you just might have to spend a few minutes figuring out what the hell you're supposed to be doing. On top of that, you're constantly fighting with poor camera controls. The camera can be finicky, especially coming out of a cutscene and during boss battles. Aside from boss battles, there are also some enemies sprinkled around the city, as well as fight challenges to earn currency, like I mentioned before. Fight challenges are absurdly easy though. They really aren't challenges by any stretch of the word. There are also some other things like races that the player can participate in, but your options are so limited, and none of it is fun. While the game is technically open world, there's nothing to actually do in it. So I'm coining the term "fopen world" here for this purpose. Somehow, Actly knows exactly how to use her magical gauntlet right away. I mean, you don't just go flying off Iron Man style like it's nothing within seconds of putting the thing on and control it the same way you will by the end of the game. That's ridiculous. Actly apparently suffers from claustrophobia and fear of elevators, but it serves literally no purpose other than being mentioned offhandedly a few times with no effect on story or gameplay. This is Actly's mother. Where's her phone exactly? To be honest, I could list a ton of nitpicks, but I'll spare you. Also, a lot of things that would be nitpicks in other games are actually missteps in this game, just because so many of those would-be nitpicks cross over that line into misstep territory. Alright, so we've come to the part of the review where I make my conclusion and give my recommendation for this game, or not. I think this game would have been better suited with less story and more action, especially early on. The game opens with way too much story, and that never really stops. The action is what the game does an okay job at, but everything else only serves to hurt pacing and take you out of any of the good parts. It's frustrating because the foundations for an interesting story and unique, fun gameplay are there, it's just all so poorly executed. Aztech wants so badly to imitate a AAA experience, but it falls far short of that. Perhaps the project was simply too ambitious of an idea for a small indie developer. In the end, it comes off as an indie game that plays like a bad AA game that wants to be a AAA game. Overall, I cannot recommend this indie alternate history futurist anime Shadow of the Colossus at the $30 price point. In fact, I couldn't recommend it if it were free, as your time is more valuable and you'll likely only get frustrated. Part of me hopes the game does well, because I think Lienzo can do something cool with a larger team going forward, but I just don't feel like Aztech deserves your hard-earned dollars. Hey guys, thanks for watching this review from the Goodnight Groofs. You can also check out all of our other reviews here on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe for future reviews, Southern Fried Groofs, and more, and check out goodnightgroofs.com for all of our content, including 2 podcasts. Shout out to our patrons. Thank you to Lienzo and Stride PR for providing a review copy of the game.